Nefertiti, the controversy about the Nefertiti bust, and it was coming in front pages, and in reality the average Egyptian wouldn't care about something like that, but it's something to distract you from other things that are happening. So it's politics. No, it's true. It's true. So because we live in downtown. My parents have never been to the Egyptian Museum, and they are very well educated. Like my dad is a doctor, my mom was a banker, but it doesn't. What I'm saying, it doesn't mean anything to the modern identity of Egyptian, which is a shame.
It is a shame.
But it doesn't, and that's what I'm saying. The SCA treats any antiquity only as ancient Egypt. We still have Coptic and Islamic antiquities that are not as protected. Not that the ancient Egyptian ones are protected anyway, but the Islamic and Coptic are just totally dismissed.
Yeah, I mean it's something I don't understand.
Which is something that I don't
exactly. You know, that's something
and we have
that
some
needs to be
amazing
addressed.
pieces, even in the mosques. We have original lanterns in mosques, like historic mosques. And then you would go in and you would ask the guard, so what happened to that lantern? You know, the naughty boys were playing football. And that's an antique lantern. It's not just a lantern, a modern one. And then they had to replace them. Like 3 years ago, they had to take them away and replace them. And the thing is, when the SA takes something away, that's it. You never know where it is. You don't know how it's
because no one was that interested in it. I bet it's not been properly recorded.
The SCA doesn't have a recording system. That's just it's horrific.
So even if it did show up in auction, no one would be able to.
No, it's horrific. It's horrific. Like even things that come out with excavations, they put them in storages. Nobody knows about them.
That's right.
Ever.
Once it's in storage,
you can only get through the reports from excavation reports, but again we have to say they're not very detailed at times. And then when they go to the storage, you might not even locate the storage.
But it's the whole, you know, it's just the wrong way round.
It's the whole system that it's very.
If you start doing it right at the beginning, then it protects
if you want to,
if you want to, and if you'd rather spend money on other things,
on opening museums that never get opened, for example, like we have thousands of museums over the past years, and none of them are open till now. And the SCA is in debt because of all the museums that they're thinking of opening, but they don't have any pieces to show them. They do have the pieces, but they don't have the means or the spirit to do it. I don't know.
That's why the UK prioritises things that are important for the national cultural heritage, and accepts that the majority of small Roman and Anglo-Saxon material will get sold to collectors.
Although at least that system is being amended on a case-by-case basis, because obviously things have and will do slip through the net.
Crosby Garrett helmet. Well, because it was made of bronze, it wasn't classified as treasure.
I can't believe no one thought of that.
Well, it's the same. Even in Egypt, some things like foundation deposits, they are fine with them being going illegally. It doesn't matter. It's just.
I mean, I don't personally see why the Crosby Garrett helmet and even the Grenell liner shouldn't be in private collections. Why not?
I was writing what I'm
No. I don't think they should be in private collections. I think there is a strong argument for first refusal.
Nothing's being recorded as we speak.
Oh,
and here it is. Oh, you're online.
No, I would say that I don't mind.
I think probably we should make a start. Okay. Right, I think we're on. Everybody ready?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, for those of you at home, welcome to the first ever EES webinar, our first ever online-only event. My name is Chris Naunton. I'm the director of the Egypt Exploration Society. Welcome to this event. We are here at Doughty Mews, the headquarters of the EES, and to explain why we're doing this, we have been building up our events programme for the last few years. We have more lectures, seminars, study days, workshops, etc. Now on the programme than we've ever had before. But the EES is an international organisation. We have a membership of some 2,500. Many of those members are in the UK and within reach of our London events, our UK events, and of course our events in Cairo. But we have many members around the world, throughout Europe, the States, increasingly in Asia, also Australasia. And we often hear that the events look very appealing, but of course they're just not accessible to people who are any distance from us. So we thought we would try to tackle this by having an event online, and we really wanted to kick what we hope will be a series of online events off with something of a bang. And so for our topic today, we have chosen the good, the bad and the ugly, cultural property and the trade in antiquities and Egyptology. This is of course a very important issue for Egyptology, for archaeology in general, and it's not an uncontentious subject as well, and we are hoping that this will stimulate lots of discussion here in our studio, but also out there in the ether. So the way that this is going to work is that we have 4 distinguished expert speakers with us today, and I'm going to invite each of them in turn to make a kind of opening statement. We've carefully selected our speakers to represent different aspects of the trade in antiquities and different points of view on this subject. So we're going to have opening statements from each of them, perhaps a little bit of discussion if we have time. This will take us up to about 2:30 our time, so in about an hour and a half. We will then break for half an hour, and then from 3 o'clock onwards we will be opening the discussion out here, and this is really where we hope to get lots of participation from those of you who are watching at home. So I'm going to introduce our panellists first of all. On my left, second from the left, we have Marcel Marais, Assistant Keeper in the Department of Ancient Egypt and Sudan at the British Museum, very close to us here, representing of course the curator's perspective on this. We have Heba Abdel Gawad, a PhD student from the University of Durham, also holder of an EES Centenary Award for her forthcoming archaeological fieldwork at Ptolemaios Hermiou, an important Middle Egyptian settlement site of the Ptolemaic period. We have Keith Amory, a PhD student in cultural property and antiquities law and the self-regulation of the UK market. Keith describes himself as being first a collector and second an academic. And to kick us off, we have Madeleine Perridge. Maddie Perridge, the head of antiquities at Bonham's Auctioneers. Maddie's worked for the company for over 6 years, starting in May 2006 as a cataloguer. She rose rapidly and became the head of department in 2009. So, can I hand over to you, Maddie, now to tell us about the antiquities house, the auction house point of view.
Thank you, Chris. So this webinar is an attempt to instigate cooperation and proper dialogue concerning the ways in which the legal antiquities trade and the academic and museum community may be able to work together in a more productive fashion to protect cultural property. I think this is a valid topic, and one that has perhaps been ignored at the expense of examinations of the ethics of the antiquities trade. At present there is still a great deal of mistrust and negative arguments, which, in my opinion, simply engender more polarised positions and even greater suspicion. As an example of what can result from these aforementioned parties working together in a spirit of cooperation, less than 30 years ago, the CBA, the Council for British Archaeology, and the academic world could barely mention the words metal detectorist without shuddering. But the PAS is one of the most successful schemes of its type. However, it took both sides bravely venturing into new territory to get this started. Now we have a mutually beneficial situation, and perhaps we should be examining if a similar model of recording fines could be replicated by other nations, perhaps extended to antiquities as a whole. Without our system, would the Staffordshire Hoard have been saved for the nation? So I would like to give a little background on the changes already within the trade and contributions the trade have made to improve things. The market for antiquities, in my opinion, has evolved in the past 15 to 20 years. There is no doubt that wrongs have and still are being committed, but this is not the whole story. The trade have been involved in many changes to the way antiquities are handled in the UK. Bonham staff and other members of the trade have been involved in select committee hearings, sat on the illicit trade advisory panel, formulated legislation and recommended that the UK accede to the Unesco Convention. The Antiquities Dealers Association, the ADA, was set up in 1982, and all members comply with their code of conduct, with IADA formed in 1993, operating on the same premise worldwide. Bonham staff have also been involved in conducting treasure valuations for the past 15 years, as have other members of the trade. This has provided a vital service that ensures finders of important material are encouraged to declare their finds, giving museums the opportunity to buy them, essentially first refusal. Our structure allows for the more generic material, perhaps not of interest to museums, to be disclaimed and offered on the open market for a fair price. We have done and continue to demonstrate that we are at the forefront of developing best practice, working with museums and academics to great effect. There are many who will disagree, but practices have changed, as have perceptions in the wider trade and the collecting world, and discussions such as this today are a vital step in further change. However, I would argue that some of the current approaches by certain factions in the academic world are not perhaps conducive to productive discussion, and in fact have the reverse effect. I would just start by giving a bit of an example of this. Laws and agreements are constantly changing. It's hard to keep up with, I'm sure, for many who are not specialists in that area, as well as to digest what you do find. There are now law firms at home and abroad with specific staff trained in this field. There are universities offering courses in Antiquities and the law, such as I'm sure Keith will go on to talk about, and the European Research Council granting substantial budgets to develop new approaches to regulate the trade. This has developed into a whole sub-industry, certainly profiting some, but perhaps not necessarily the people we would hope. The trade are also barely aware of what's going on here, or that their names are being given without their permission as part of a list of organisations for students to research, usually with, if not a highly biased approach, certainly not a neutral one. I would argue for a reappraisal and greater balance here, so that the trade and collectors are not permanently put on the defensive and examined under the microscope without their even realising it. It's quite a lot to hope that all collectors and dealers are going to be happy to allow public access to their material, when the auction houses and those who do are publicly scrutinised in the worst possible way. There have been certainly some positive moves by the trade, and I would argue that one of the most important advances is the advent of the internet. Auction houses such as Bonham's now release their catalogues publicly, every single item photographed with a list of provenance. This has, of course, inevitably increased the spotlight on our activities and the material we handle, which I agree is largely a good thing, as it also has the effect of ensuring that every object we sell at public auction is available for academic study. Good quality photos are provided, and also the opportunity for academics, as members of the public, to view and handle the pieces. An example of other productive communication is that Bonhams have recently granted to the Beasley Archive permission to use our catalogue images of attic vases on their public database. We'd be very happy to extend this type of arrangement with other institutions. Surely the more material made publicly available, along with its known collection and publication history, the better for all concerned. It's an important step in the right direction that we now publish all the information we can, which, if compared to catalogues printed even 10 years ago, is a considerable amount. In fact, Bonhams publishes all lots, unsold as well as sold, which is a lot more than many do. A number of dealers also publish catalogues, and many collectors as well, in terms of their collections, and this should surely be encouraged. Any other approach is hardly constructive and will in no way incentivise those who do not go as far as auction houses do. I'm sure many will disagree, but I feel there is merit to a more pragmatic approach. It's a little bit like closing the door after the horse has bolted. No one is denying that awful things have occurred, but if we are trying to prevent worse in the future, discussions such as this one I think are crucial. Archaeologically rich nations should be supported and encouraged to find ways to prevent further looting, rather than the often politically motivated efforts to repatriate material which is already on public view. Sorry. Okay, so more positive moves by the trade in terms of direct communications with museums. So, because we sell at public auction, as I've mentioned, institutions have a chance to buy on the open market and at a fair price. Bonhams certainly do their best to ensure that institutions are aware of what's forthcoming, with email notifications of sale dates, as well as the frequent furnishing of complimentary catalogues. There are also instances when we receive something unusual or problematic, and this is when a closer connection between trade and the academic community would have many benefits to both sides. Bonhams have been showing objects to academics, including the British Museum, since the Antiquities Department was founded more than 20 years ago. Through this process, museums surely then have an opportunity to see objects. They may be of interest to them prior to sale. Certainly with the slash budgets for museums worldwide, maybe a little advance warning, give the institutions extra time to raise funds. You know, if there's an interesting object about to hit the market, surely this is a better way round to go. Equally, there's been much discussion of faked antiquities. Surely a sensible way to reduce this is to encourage the antiquities trade to consult institutions. We'd love the assistance, rather than vilifying the academics who are willing to do so. This issue also swings both ways, as museums have occasionally been taken in by clever fakes purchased directly from private sellers, whereas perhaps I could argue that auction houses such as Bonhams see a vast number of faked antiquities as well, and so can perhaps bring another set of eyes to the table, possibly. The British Museum would, I am sure, acknowledge the role played by Bonhams, not the Egyptian Department, in uncovering the existence of now well-known fakes. As Marcel will, I'm sure, discuss in further detail, this issue of academics and the trade is extremely divisive. There are two highly polarised sides of the debate, and let's face it, it's going to take more than goodwill to bridge the gap. So, how do we get beyond all this? With Egyptian items, we've already made efforts to build a closer relationship with academics, both to authenticate and date material, also to ensure, if there's a concern the item has been illicitly removed, then all concerned have time to investigate. As I've mentioned, we show a lot of material to the British Museum, and we've had some very positive outcomes. We had one example some time ago. We were concerned about some reliefs. They'd been sent to us for research, quite distinctive, had sharp cutting lines, bit worried. So we took them to the British Museum, who did some research, got in contact with the relevant archaeologist at the site in Egypt, in the hope we could prove where they come from, and if they had indeed been illicitly removed. These pieces had in fact a named pre-1983 provenance, as the owner had been assured. Happily, that archaeologist was able to provide the proof needed. The owner was happy to donate the pieces to Egypt. Constructive example of all sides working together, without acrimony, for a mutually beneficial outcome. And I would really strongly urge that more institutions offer their services in this way, so that the international trade can check items of concern. It's much better that it's part of our due diligence process, and it involves direct communication with expert academics, and we will welcome the chance to extend this further. I hope Marcel can contribute to that. I would also quote IARDA that a much more effective way of doing this would be to put together an internationally accessible picture library of lost artworks, which has to be clearly structured and available online. However, I recognise that this is unlikely to happen without due investment. All our lots are in fact checked by the Art Loss Register, the ALR, and they in turn check against other international databases which we perhaps don't have the easiest access to, including those of Scotland Yard and Interpol. In the absence of nations, however, making available their literature and images of lost material, surely we must rely on expert academics to help repatriate these sorts of pieces. I acknowledge that part of the problem is that nations are barely aware of what is missing, let alone able to supply images and notes to such as the ALR. Many countries have a serious domestic problem with theft, combined with a lack of museum records is very troubling. Bonhams go to considerable efforts to check that pieces are not stolen, but communication with more academics would certainly assist in this matter. For example, one of my colleagues was researching a piece of sculpture. He came across the item published as being in a museum. Okay. He immediately contacted the museum to find out if maybe it had been deaccessioned, only to find that as far as the museum was concerned, the piece was still in their museum. I hasten to add that swiftly it was arranged that this piece was repatriated to the country in question. However, it is impossible for us to examine every book, catalogue, journal, in the hope we stumble accidentally across something, but we do make every effort. If we had greater input, perhaps, from museum experts and academics across the board in all departments, who, of course, are much more specialised in these areas, we would have a much stronger chance of finding these pieces. In line with the ADA and IARDA codes of conduct, we require vendors to provide their name and address, to sign and date a provenance form confirming it's the unencumbered property of the vendor, and they are authorised to sell it. They must also provide information about where and when they acquired it, if it's been previously published, auction catalogues, whether it has an export licence, and any other information concerning its collection history. If an object is then flagged up in the proper legal process, we not only cooperate, but make sure the right solution is reached. For example, an Egyptian relief we offered in sale some years ago had been offered by another auction house several years before that, and again had a pre-1983 provenance. Presumably between it being offered the first time and its most recent outing, the Egyptian cultural authorities realised it was missing, and put together a dossier proving its illegal removal. On receipt of this, we were entirely happy to work with Scotland Yard to have the piece repatriated. When these processes work, we feel something good has happened. Something more is known. This is a highlight of the business, and very satisfying on all sides. There are of course still problems, which both these items highlighted. They came with a pre-1983 provenance, which turned out to be false. Regarding the former, the British Museum were able to assist with repatriation prior to sale, an excellent result. And regarding the latter, if the Egyptian authorities knew the piece was looted, why did they not submit that material to the ALR or another relevant authority? This is an industry in transition. The support of the academic community in assisting those of us who are moving in the right direction would be really welcome, although I admit perhaps unlikely on some fronts. So in terms of practical approaches going forward, I want to point out firstly that due to perhaps moving goalposts in terms of provenance requirements and various nations' import regulations, there are a whole section of objects which were bought post-1970, but pre the period when provenance was commonly passed on or published. They were bought in good faith, on the open market, usually published in an auction catalogue, but in the eyes of many are dubious because provenance was not recorded at that time. There should be a more realistic approach to this material. Largely, these objects are on public record already, so academics and cultural authorities should be aware of them and have had plenty of time to look into their status and the options of possible repatriation. According to the New York Times, a recent study found that as many as 100,000 privately owned ancient Greek, Roman and related classical objects in the United States, would be unable to pass muster with most museums. Who is losing out here when such potentially important artefacts just disappear into private collections because no one wants to risk the negative publicity of handling them? What about, for example, say an elderly woman whose mother was a friend of Howard Carter in the 20s? Maybe she's got a collection of really nice amulets. We all know archaeologists in the early part of the 20th century were allowed to keep a lot of the more commonly found objects. So, okay, it might be a stretch, but it may be that these amulets were recorded somewhere as part of an excavation. Some more information exists, but has been misplaced. Equally, a lot of the Egyptian material sold on the art market is of little or no interest to the academic world. How many museums do you think want a collection of 20 white steatite scarabs donated to them, let alone want to spend money on them? They've been published, they're hardly disappearing without a trace, and if a museum did want to buy them or study them, then they have an opportunity to do so. Perhaps the investment poured into the study of cultural trafficking could also be of use to academics who want to try and restore the lost provenance of such pieces, such as perhaps we can say the Beasley Archive do with the Marlborough gems. It's all very well trying to prevent the sale of illicit objects, but there should also be an equal engagement with researching these objects with their lost provenance, and this is something we could all work towards. If your attitude is that of a well-known academic, that antiquities without provenance might as well be destroyed, then those of us who love ancient art and history, for more than its precise context, are going to disagree. The reason most collectors and dealers, such as myself, work with antiquities is because they hold a deep and abiding passion for these things. This is the reason, rather than investment and profit, as perhaps you would find with contemporary art collectors, is why many thousands of individuals are prepared to spend money on antiquities. This whole process of communication between collector and academic would of course be assisted by trying to find more ways of improving communication and trust. The stance taken by many means that collectors will increasingly wish to remain private so as not to have their reputations further tarnished, and I don't blame them. Why would a self-respecting collector or frankly dealer wish to engage in a process where they are always portrayed as being the bad guys? Surely this love for ancient art should be harnessed to help save sites under attack, objects in danger of being lost or damaged. Private collectors donate vast sums to museums and other academic institutions, and I'm sure that if the academic world were encouraged and able to work more closely with us in other ways, more good could come of it. I will welcome suggestions from Marcel as to how we can better improve our approach. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maddie. What a great way to start us off. There was an awful lot in that,
Yes.
I think, which is great. We'll hand over, I think, straight away to hear a different perspective.
Or perhaps not so different.
Or perhaps not so different.
Yeah, so the museum community's take on this is essentially identical to the scholarly community's take, I think. There are people with there's a wide range of opinions here, but there is an increasing awareness, I do think, that the antiquities trade is not going to disappear, and so the way to deal with it is not to shutter ourselves to blinker ourselves from the fact, but to try and ensure that things are as properly documented as possible. Museums are not always in a position to buy certain things, as Maddie already mentioned. If there's no clear track records, we can't afford the risk to buy certain things. There may be no clear indications that things have been on the market for longer than, since the 1970s Unesco Convention. But even if we can't buy, we certainly can document. And I was pleasantly surprised that you mentioned the portable antiquities scheme, because it's right here at the bottom of my page. I do also feel strongly that this would be a very suitable approach to things. Of course, one can argue that every dealer should be taking care of properly publishing what they have on their premises. Of course, auction houses today are doing very well. Sotheby's, Christie's, Bonhams are all publishing these wonderful glossy catalogues. Every single object is illustrated. In fact, not so very long ago, this was not the case in these catalogues, certainly not in the Sotheby's ones. But there are many other dealers who, they may have a website, but sometimes you're lucky enough to find even one or two pictures of anything from Egypt, even though they're regularly trading Egyptian antiquities, not to mention any other fields of interest, of course. It would be nice, of course, if say, the existence, the licensing of a dealer would be conditional on transparency about what they actually offer for sale. They are not like any other shop. Of course, normally you need to visit a shop to know what's on offer. But with dealers in antiquities, we're dealing with cultural heritage, material that is of interest to mankind as a whole. And so I've always found it somewhat surprising that all these dealers can exist without apparently being pressured in any way to publicize what they trade in. You have to visit them most of the time to know what's on offer. So I also ended up thinking of the portable antiquities scheme, in that one could envisage a system whereby appointed liaison officers would carefully monitor what's appearing on the market and be contacted, just as people finding metal objects in the ground are supposed to report things. So could dealers simply keep us informed about what is passing through their premises, and then not the dealers themselves, but appointed people, perhaps employed by a museum, could record those, document those objects properly, and also in fact inform the dealers about the importance of the objects. Are they, for starters, authentic? There's an awful lot on offer still today that is simply fake, but also give the dealers a better idea about the likely archaeological provenance of certain material, which may not necessarily be documented heretofore, but it may sometimes be reconstructable, and for that sort of purpose you need expertise, archaeological expertise. So it will be of mutual benefit if such collaboration took place on a more regular basis, in a more formalized way. Within the Egyptian department in the British Museum, I'm usually the person who gets emails from various auction houses with queries about authenticity and date and so on, and I find this extremely useful. But it's remarkable that this sort of arrangement is not much more common. I mean, there are many academics who do not take a particular interest in what's happening on the market, but I think we should all be interested, because the material appearing on the market can in fact only be studied while it is on offer before it disappears again, quite possibly in a private collection. It's only during a short spell when something is, when an artifact is in the public domain, that you can actually study it. You may not be able to buy it for whatever reason, but you can study it, or at least document it. And just as we do that, the thousands of antiquities that are found in UK soil, so we can document what appears, so to speak, on UK soil, on the market then, before it disappears again into private ownership, as it's of course the case for all the metal objects that may be found in the UK. I mean, there is a continued entitlement to private ownership there, so that's not the issue, but at least things will be documented and therefore in a sense safe for mankind as a whole and for future research. I think that's really the main point I would want to present at this point, and we can see how things develop.
So the most important thing then is the idea that as long as we can have the information and the opportunity is there for that to get out. It's interesting, that's come across in both of your talks actually, that as long as the information is out there, that's really the most important thing.
If you don't document, you enhance the sort of destruction in a way. I mean, it's already sad if things have been found without proper documentation and then appeared on the market, but you can still rescue certain information, or in fact reconstruct it, so long as that material is actually submitted for appraisal to the academic community.
And that's exactly why the stance, Maddie, that you mentioned of one academic, that if it's unprovenance, the object is useless, is not something you would agree with, because as Marcel says, there's still a lot you can get.
By that reckoning, you'd have to say all archaeological objects pre-1970, before we started worrying about this question, all these old Victorian collections that says from Thebes, by that reckoning they would all be useless as well.
Useless academically, yeah. Clearly not something we could agree with, I think. Okay, can I hand over then to our next speaker, Heba Abdel-Gawad, who brings a perspective as an Egyptologist, archaeologist, and also an Egyptian. So, Heba.
Okay, thank you. I have to say, like, my conversation would shift away from everything that has been said, and I would like to bring, like, foremost the point of view of an Egyptian to begin with, before being an archaeologist or an Egyptologist. I think I'm a representative of Egypt for the day, so not the 80 million, of course, just myself, but I'll try. I'll try as much as I can. I have to say, like, I've always thought about it. It brings good memories when I go to the British Museum and I see some pieces there on display, and then you go back to Egypt to visit, and then you see the Egyptian Museum and how the pieces are displayed the way they are. Sometimes Egyptians are very much in favor emotionally of returning everything back, legal trading shouldn't be allowed, trading in antiquities or in ancient Egyptian objects shouldn't be allowed at all. But then thinking about it from a scientific point of view or an academic point of view, as you said, it's a way of preventing looting. But the problem is that now thinking about it, and Keith was just telling me before, why don't you legalize trade in antiquity in Egypt? And I don't see any opportunity of this happening. First of all, we have a lot of problems to begin with. The first thing would be we lack the expertise of someone who would be able to identify the objects. We do have archaeologists as such, but they are not trained in this respect to begin with. That's one thing. The second thing is we don't have this culture. Like if you had it on display, then this would mean we're opening it to an international market or we're just opening it to a national market. I wouldn't expect someone who's Egyptian to go to an auction house and buy a statue, even if it's for Tutankhamun, let's say a golden one. He wouldn't do it. Not for lack of interest, but there are other implications that we have to think about. For us as Egyptians nowadays, being like a descendant of ancient Egypt or whatever, this is something that is not very relevant to us at the minute. It's only something that you bring at times of crisis. I was just telling Keith before, when the revolution happened, when you want to glorify specific past, things that you've lost throughout time, that's only when we bring ancient Egypt into the scenery. But in reality, even if you have the money, we don't have that interest in antiquity. Go to any Egyptian museum and look of how many Egyptians are there who are not just there for the sake of study. They are there because they are visiting the culture. That's something that should change. And now that there are waves of change in the country, maybe we should start prioritizing our own interests. Maybe we should look to our past, but in a more positive way. Looting since the revolution has exceeded, and I was just telling Marcel, like even there are now new markets for looting. Before it was mainly in America, Russia, in the West, but nowadays we've had 3 cases where artifacts were smuggled to Dubai, were smuggled to Turkey, were smuggled to Jordan. That's new markets are coming up, things that nobody can trace. And the problem is, first of all, and I hope I'm not being controversial here, mainly those who are caught with illicit antiquity trade in Egypt, they are mainly highly influential political figures. And that's very difficult because most of them are members of the parliament. They have, no, I'm talking about the previous regime. And for us, like being a member of the parliament, you have some type of immunity. You're not supposed to be questioned by any police or anything unless you get a warranty from the head of the parliament. And you can only be questioned if you're caught doing it. That's the only way that you lose your immunity. And then we had a lot of cases, like last year when I was in Sohag inspecting some sites for my PhD, and I've had few conversations with people, and people speak about looting openly. That's something that people would talk to me about it, and they don't even know me. They don't know I'm an archaeologist or anything. And he would tell me, like, my life dream is to find a bride. And I thought he was talking about a bride, like a physical bride, like to marry someone. And it turned out that the bride is the nickname of a statue. That's like his dream in life is to find a statue, and then he would hand it in to someone who's influential. I'm not naming names. And then he works with them in the area, and then he gets smuggled some way. The thing is, people openly speak about it. In Upper Egypt specifically, and in Delta, one of the areas that is suffering, Kafr Sheikh, for example, suffering severely from looting, even before the revolution and now. Areas like Giza Plateau, Nazat al-Simmel, that's looting, that's something that it's normal that you discuss this, that you talk about looting, that could be your daily conversation. And people don't feel that there is something wrong with it, because for them, okay, it is defined by the Egyptian law that this is cultural property, but you haven't done anything to the nation to make them aware of what does cultural property actually mean. So for them, it doesn't mean anything. It means I can have extra cash, because in reality, they tend to sell them with much more less money than they are worth, because it goes to a specific smuggler or illicit trader, then he gets it to the market, and it gets like sold for more money than he actually have bought it from the person who looted it to begin with. So that's a problem. How can we solve this? I don't see legal trade of antiquity in Egypt happening at all. I don't think this would happen, for a variety of reasons. Now they are not allowing any piece of antiquity, even if you owned it, it's not supposed to go outside Egypt. It doesn't go outside the country. It has to remain in Egyptian soil. Fair enough. But then the thing is, you don't, if you do possess a piece of antiquity, they now encourage you, after the 2009 law, that you're now encouraged to go to the SCA and record it. And since this law has been implemented, and I've checked, no one has ever gone and reported a piece that they possess. because again we do have lack of trust with the system. So you think I'll go with my piece and I try to record it, but I always have in the back of my mind that I will go back home without that piece. I'm not retaining it anymore. It's the bureaucracy, it's the system not working, and it's very problematic, and it all tends to go down to politics. And there are other implications nowadays, now with the regime changing, like even Keith was asking me now, having Muslim Brotherhood, what would happen with Antiquities, stuff like that. I don't think that's an issue, because the problem is nobody thinks about Antiquities in Egypt at all. Yeah, it's true. No, it is true. It is true. Like I'm not trying to bring a bad name for Egyptians or something, but I'm thinking like maybe that's a wake-up call. Maybe we should start rethinking of how our lives should go and how we should prioritize our lives, because I was saying before, even our definition of Antiquities like lies only in ancient Egypt. Yes, this is where the majority of our antiquity comes from, but we do as well have some Coptic artifacts, Islamic artifacts. They are as equally important, but again they are not looked very much upon because people think they are not as expensive as the ancient Egyptian material, maybe because they are not very much to be for a foreign market as pieces from ancient Egypt. They do tend to be more appealing than other pieces. So that's again another issue that we have. So we need to have some waves of change in the way we do education. And I was thinking, for example, how can we change this? How can I go to an archaeological site and try to speak to the community? Looting is bad. You shouldn't, even if you do possess a piece, go and report it to the SCA. You can't go and preach at this level. This is something people wouldn't understand, because at the end of the day, what he cares about, okay, I need to have dinner to my children at the end of the day. That's not a priority. Me trying to protect cultural heritage, what would this bring back to my life? Nothing. So we need to define cultural property within the Egyptian community more. And then something else that I've noticed, like talking about like legal trading in antiquity, which I don't mind at all. I have nothing against it as long as everything is documented. Even me, while doing my research, I've relied a lot on some, like Sotheby's, for example. Like they have online catalogs, and I've been in touch with them. They are very helpful. They would send me full details about the pieces, how they were retrieved, and everything. So it's quite helpful, even doing research. Pieces like sculpture models that people think, oh, they are not very academic interest. Well, actually, they are. They are. Like it's when you put everything into context, you would find the academic interest out of it. And how can you define academic interest to begin with? It's very subjective. It's different. Like we don't all possess the same interest anyway. So how can you define academic interest? But then thinking about it, where does Egypt as a state exist in like antiquity trading outside Egypt? Like where are the links? Does the SCA actually have any type of connection with the legal traders? Not in the sense to try to retrieve the objects back if they were looted, but on the sense of even keeping documentation of the Egyptian pieces, because at the end of the day, I think that's what heritage is all about. Like as a country, you have to keep an archive of what's happening, documenting. So we have a cultural heritage problem of understanding, and we have a problem in realization even within Egypt itself. Universities, or the academic community of Egyptologists, are very much isolated from the SCA as an institution. There is no cooperation whatsoever, except for if you're few academics going in committees. So, and this tends to the lack of conversation, and sometimes the lack of taking things forward in a way. It tends to be more administrative rather than a research institution, which I don't think that's what it's supposed to be. At the end of the day, there should be some collaboration on both levels. And the other problem, which I would stress again, is the problem of documentation, and that's something that we do suffer from. Even pieces that tend to get illicitly smuggled inside the country, like they are caught before leaving Egypt, then no one knows where do they go. No one keeps record of how. Okay, there would be a committee that would go and inspect the pieces, see if they are authentic or not. Okay, fine, they are authentic. Now, and what happens after that? That's very much in the dark. Nobody knows anything about, and it could be of relevance to academic community, the research community, because how can you know the value of them? Or as we were saying, academic interest should be broad, so everything should get into the wider research community, because that's what we owe people outside as well. If you have an interest in ancient Egypt, which is good publicity for me, it brings me back money at the end of the day. Most of the tourism we get because of people visiting museums or that have passion about antiquity, as you say, that's a very important aspect of the economy that we we rely majorly on. But then again, I have something to give back to this research community. There should be, I think, more collaboration between the Egyptian side of things and the international side of things, not only in like legal trading, but in the academic community itself, something that we need to go beyond going and excavating. We need to be actually collaborating, being active, not just go there and excavate and report and maybe have some field school, but we need more collaboration in the way, I think things, now it's the time that maybe we could take the opportunity that things are changing. Maybe now it's the time things to actually change. And seeing what has been happening over the year, there are a lot of promising examples of Egyptian academics everywhere, and the youth, they really want things to change. So there should be an opportunity. I don't know, maybe I sound too optimistic. I don't know how we can do it, but there must be a way of getting this together. Maybe this would be a way like establishing a certain group, a support group or something that we could do, start speaking to local communities in a way that is not of a preaching type of thing, something that goes back and with an understanding of the religious and social implications of the country, because again, that's at stake. One of the reasons I don't think anybody who's Egyptian would go and legally have a trade in antiquity is there is a religious implication as well of possessing a piece of antiquity and keeping it in the house. So it's very difficult and it's very controversial, and I hope that there would be more collaboration on all sides, on the SCA with the academic community in Egypt, and the SCA with the academic communities outside, and with the SCA and the legal traders of antiquity as well. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Hiba. Again, lots of issues raised. It's great to have a sort of perspective from inside Egypt, if you like. I think it's really important. We're getting lots of questions coming in, which is great, but I think we'll stick to our original plan and we'll just take our final opening statement before we throw the discussion open. As I suspect, as the questions start coming in, we may get sort of dragged off. So I'd like to give Keith the floor now, Keith Amery, who, as I mentioned, is a specialist in cultural property law and the regulation of the UK market for the trade in antiquities, a collector and academic. So Keith, your viewpoint, please.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. And obviously I'm not David Gill as advertised. And our opinions will be sort of diametrically opposed, so it would have been interesting if we both could have debated this question. I'm as a last minute speaker, I'm doing this off the cuff. I don't have notes, so forgive me if I change direction occasionally. It saddens me in some ways from what Heather has said so far that there is not an interest in Egypt itself amongst Egyptians for the acquisition and collecting of antiquities. And what I would take issue with would be the recent the parliamentary debate before the 2010 change in the law, and said there was a very vociferous, the other side of the parliament were very vociferously arguing for a return to the old pre-1983 system. I think it's a shame that Egyptians themselves cannot collect their own antiquities and enjoy free private ownership laws as we do in this country. I think there is definitely an interest amongst some Egyptians to collect, and there always was, and there probably always will be. But it seems you're almost forced to be an expatriate Egyptian to be able to collect from the London or New York markets. What I really want to talk about today is to clarify the legal position, because it's all very well with debates, and you can get so far by saying it would be nice if this happened and this is the ideal situation. But I think I'd like to bring it back and try and say, well, what is the legal situation? What is the reality? And in terms of law, we divide. We've got to think in terms of a global market. Excuse me. We've got to think in terms of a global market these days, with the access to the internet, with the free flow of trade. You know, this is a global problem. Although today, obviously, we're specifically talking about Egyptian antiquities. The UK law divides the world into sort of three basic types of states. There's what we term the source countries, such as Egypt, but also including the obvious sort of Greece, Italy. The market countries, which is largely the UK, America. It's become, as has already been mentioned, it's spreading to the sort of ex-Russian states, Eastern Europe, and the Far East and the Gulf states. And the transit countries, where the antiquities pass through on their way to the illicit markets. Mentioning no names, but there's a country bordering Egypt where it's clearly quite possible to get this illicit material out and onto the market. Although the UK may be seen initially as a final destination market country, it also fulfills all three roles. It's it's often quoted that it's the second largest market after New York, so it's a major transit country. We also have our own archaeological heritage. It's a source country for Roman and Anglo-Saxon material. So I want to address the question basically, what is legally possible in the market? And two key dates come up, and that's the 1970 Unesco Convention, which is, to give it its full and rather long-winded title, is the Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Objects and Cultural Goods. And this is a very specific point that I would like people to bear in mind, that it's this particular international law, it's a bilateral agreement. It has to be agreed between two countries, so say a source country like Egypt and a market country where illicit antiquities have ended up, say the UK. And that law specifically also, as well as being intended to protect the archaeological heritage and the rights of museums, it specifically protects the right of a free market. It describes the objects as cultural goods, not as cultural objects. It is accepted through UNESCO that this material will be, and it is legal to trade, obviously until a law steps in to sort of bar that trade. But the important thing about UNESCO is it's a bilateral agreement. It has to be agreed between the source country and the final destination country for these for the convention to work effectively. Now, the date of 1983 is the significant key date for Egypt, because up until this point it was not illegal to export antiquities from Egypt. And in 1983 you have the Law 117, which specifically put a stop to the export of antiquities originating from Egypt, whether they were in private hands, dealer's stock, or coming straight out of an archaeological excavation. The 1983 law is a state ownership law. Now, in terms of archaeology and law, the key publications are the works of Patrick O'Keefe and Lyndall Prott, and on the volumes on archaeological excavation and movement, they have said all along there is nothing extra to be gained from a law investing ownership in the state. State ownership does not equal protection. It does not add an extra element of interest. If anything, it deprives the local population and people, say the Egyptian people that should have an interest in their heritage, if anything, it takes away any incentive to protect and preserve antiquities. A very good statement that came out when the 1983 law was initiated. Bernard Bothmer of the, you might have to help me here on this one, Chris, I think he was a curator of Brooklyn Museum. He did a wonderful statement that said, initially, before the 1983 law investing ownership in the state, he said the Egyptian culture used to be wonderfully organised. He said not a single small antiquity was lost, because every chance find would be passed on, whether sort of from a building site, and a lot of antiquities, we have to remember, would be destroyed because they're found on sort of building sites or agricultural land. Now, what Bernard Bothmer said was, before this law, every tiny bead and amulet would have been passed on to a local dealer who would have traded it up to the main markets in Cairo and Alexandria. This stuff would have made its way to the international markets, and eventually it would have found its level and a home. What happened with the 1983 law? By investing ownership in the state, suddenly there was no incentive for local chance find discoveries to be reported. And if anything, the law was so strict in the punishment that if the farmer or builder didn't report this material, or his neighbour decided to report him instead, it could end up in not only the confiscation of the material, but the confiscation of the land and livelihood, leading to the sort of destitution of families that are already on a subsistence level. So the 1983 law doesn't particularly benefit Egypt. It doesn't protect the antiquities. We've seen there's still an awful lot of illicit material making its way onto the market. Now, the regulation of the trade in this country has already been mentioned, and I know Bonhams is a member of the Antiquities Dealers Association, and to clarify the abbreviations, and the International Association of Dealers in Ancient Art. Now, other leading auction houses are not, and they could do more to help to regulate these markets by sort of signing up to the same level of commitment in terms of self-regulation and just basically, you know, sort of monitoring, you know, not accepting. There seems to be at the moment it's more important for certain auction houses to accept high value objects and to achieve high sales values. Publishable, it's good to get out the sort of news headlines that says, you know, we now hold the world record not only for an antiquity but a sculpture of any period. If you happen to come across a $57 million price tag, you'll know what I'm talking about. But the law, as I see it, the Egyptian law didn't really do anything to protect antiquities. And as Heber was saying, if there's then no incentive for Egyptians to take an interest in their own heritage, but thanks to the Egypt Exploration Society, thanks to organisations like this, television programs, we in the West have the benefit of, we have the interest, and our culture and our society allows the free ownership of property, and we want the rights to be able to collect. Now, I would say I'm fairly unique in that I've done undergraduate degrees in Egyptology, I've done degrees in law, so I'm not just a collector. You know, I actually would like to think I have some idea of what I'm talking about. And I would want to continue to collect, and I would want to collect ethically and legally in a way that one day, should I ever be fortunate enough to own a decent antiquity, that I could loan it to a museum or donate it, and that it would be exhibited without any concerns. To clarify the problem with the dates, I mean, the 1970 UNESCO Convention date is thrown out as a standard cut-off point of, we will, by the sort of part of archaeology that vilifies the trade, and they say, you know, anything before 1970 we'll consider, anything after 1970 we'll consider illicit. It's the guilty until proven innocent argument, and this just doesn't hold water. The 1970 date is not a cut-off point. Although that's the date of the convention, it does not become legal until both sides are signed up to the convention. And the UK did not sign up to the Unesco Convention until 2002, more than 40 years after its inception. Unfortunately, for countries like Egypt, the UK also does not impose the sanctions of other countries' cultural heritage laws. So although it was illegal to export antiquities from Egypt from 1983 onwards, there's sort of this grey area between 1970 and 1983 of what's legal and what isn't. But equally, the UK would not have any responsibility to impose that law until they signed up to the Unesco Convention of 2002. And although, it was not incumbent on the government, it was not necessary to have an enacting law on the statute books, they did then also, following the illicit trade advisory panel discussions, they then introduced the 2003 Dealing in Cultural Objects Offences Act, which was intended to then regulate the market and impose these sanctions. Now, to date, there have been no single prosecutions under the 2003 Act, which may come as some surprise to you. But legally, this grey area between 1970 and 2002, there was no agreement between the UK and Egypt to return material anyway. Now, Lord Renfrew asked this question in the House of Parliament. He said, if an object is illegally exported from its country of origin, is it legal to import it into the UK? And the surprising answer from the House of Lords was, well, actually, yes, it is legal, because there was no agreement until the United Kingdom signed up to the UNESCO Convention. So I think basically the point I want to make is, when you get these archaeological publications come out with titles like Loot, Plunder, The Rape of Heritage and all this, there is no difference between the material that came out before the 1970 convention and the material up until 2002, not legally. The real problem, and I do agree that Egypt should not lose its heritage. The key date is the 1983 law, and anything that came out of Egypt after 1983, I would say yes, definitely is illegal in every sense of the word. That I have no issue with. What we were talking about before this discussion went live, though, is also this issue of how many antiquities are actually in circulation. And I think the archaeological community and sort of non-specialists, can't get their head around the figures that it's, we are talking about millions of small objects. And the priority should be on focusing the protection onto significant objects of the cultural heritage. Now, to wrap up, I would just say what we do in the UK is we have something called the Waverly Criteria, which I won't remember off the top of my head, but you can look up online. And it's 3 basic points that tries to determine that any object, and it doesn't have to be of British origin, but it tries to say when an object comes up for sale and export, like, would its loss be of significance to the cultural heritage of the country? And I think all countries like Egypt would benefit from almost going back to the system of partage and saying, it's not possible to maintain control over the entire archaeological heritage, but the priority is to focus on the items whose loss, although the rest of the panel may disagree on these points, the objects that have already been lost, such as the Nefertiti head, the Rosetta Stone, things that are of significance to the cultural heritage of the country, and have really been held on to, more for their marketing value, it has to be said, than their sort of study and historical interest. Now, that's another controversial point, which I'd expect a few questions to finish on.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Keith. Thank you especially for doing this off the cuff.
Off the top of my head.
Pretty impressive stuff.
If the dates are wrong, it's off the top of my head. So
No. That's excellent. I should say that Keith has joined us at the very last minute as a replacement for Professor David Gill, who couldn't be with us. But that was terrific. I think, again, a whole new series of points brought in. The discussion is
hot,
raging online, I gather. We are slightly ahead of schedule, but what I propose to do, unless any of our panellists have any burning points they want to make or questions they want to ask now, that we take a break, have a think about what we've all discussed so far. Have a look at what's coming online. We'll take a break for half an hour and then we'll come back with some pointers. So for all of those of you at home, we're going to take a break for now. I make it just gone 2 o'clock, so we'll be back in half an hour's time at 2:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.